Hello and welcome. It's great to see you all start joining. I will give you a minute while we wait for people to get settled in and connected. And in the meantime, I'm going to launch our first poll. You'll see it pop up on your screen. I'm curious to see what's bringing you to today's webinar. Is it, educational, beginning stages, prevalent customer? Let me know. And a little intro. My name is Melissa. I work here in business development. And today we are joined by Joseph Martinez, retired managing director and Chief Procurement Officer of BNY Mellon. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. And we also have Scott Lang, our very own VP of Product Marketing. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Melissa. How are you?
Doing fine. And today, Joseph is going to show you how to prepare your TPRM program for the new SEC Cybersecurity Disclosure Rules. And as a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll get this along with the slide deck shortly after the webinar. And lastly, you're all muted, so just use the Q&A box for any of those questions you might have during the webinar. And without further ado, I will let Joseph get started. Go ahead.
Great, thank you, Bill. Really appreciate you guys from the Prevalent team inviting me to speak with the host of representatives that are on today. I understand that we have over 600 people that are attending, so that's a great thing. This is a crucial topic, and it's a topic that I want to kind of set the standard and say that it's an evolving topic, because the comment period is still open. So, let's begin. There's a lot of information that we need to get through, and I do want to get to some Q&A. So with that, if we could get to the next slide, please. So, today's agenda, what we really want to do is we want to talk to you about how to prepare for your program for the new SEC Cybersecurity Disclosure Rules. In our agenda, we're going to be covering, as you can read there, a brief background on the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. We're going to look at defining the proposed updates for the SEC security rules, and there are many, over 500 pages, uncover the important third-party considerations in the proposed amendments, and then identify critical third-party risk management capabilities to address these requirements. So if we could go to the next slide, and the next slide. So really briefly, the U.S. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, it plays a vital role in regulating the public companies and protecting investors by ensuring that organizations maintain transparency and disclosed revelation of information, right? So this was actually established in 1929, and this came about, actually 1934. It came about because of the stock crash of 1929. So it was created to try and restore public confidence in the financial markets. And, one of the SEC's primary functions is to enforce disclosure requirements from public companies, which can include information on financial performance, corporate governance, various risks, including those related to cybersecurity. Next slide. So the SEC's Division of Corporate Finance has focused more on cybersecurity in recent years. And so if you think back, cybersecurity really wasn't a big thing at the very beginning of the internet, and then it became something that's really growing. So in recent years, the SEC has focused more on cybersecurity, recognizing the increasing frequency and the severity of the cyber threats and their potential impact on investors and financial markets. So they published some guidelines for cybersecurity in 2011. They then updated that with an additional imperative guidelines in 2018. And these guidelines are outlining the expectations for public companies to disclose material cybersecurity risks and incidents, even if they've not yet experienced a breach. And so that's important to kind of set as a context, because now the proposed updates are going to be significantly different. So if we could go to the next slide. And one more. So the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, they recently proposed some new rules and amendments to enhance the standards for cybersecurity and risk management. So third-party incident reporting from public companies is going to be a big thing. The updates aim to address the growing cyber threats that businesses face and to provide investors with a more comprehensive and consistent information about companies' cybersecurity practices and risks. So when you look at what's being proposed there, they're really looking at a broad suite of new rules that are really going to impact many market participants, including really what are these policies and procedures that they need to address the cybersecurity risks. And then they're now requiring a written incident response programs to be established for public disclosures. And they're creating new types of SEC filings that actually are kind of an extension of the systems compliance and integrity. So the SCI to large broker dealers and other types of firms, these requirements are going to impose some significant new costs and enforcement risks for much of the securities industry. This is a big deal, folks. And you know, when we talk about the proposed array of new cybersecurity requirements, you know, they're going to be pretty expansive in terms of what they're doing. So there's going to be an expansive new Rule 10, which we'll get into. They're going to be extending the reach of the SCI, and then they're going to be expanding the S2P requirements, including incident response programs. So the SEC has also reopened the comment period for the cybersecurity rules, in case you guys aren't aware of that, for investment advisor and investment companies. They opened it up a couple of months ago. It will be closing for comment on the 22nd of May. So this is happening real time, right? So if there's still opportunity for you guys to go, you can go to the Fed Register and take a look at what the proposed amendments are. I have them actually in an appendix, and you can click on there, get in there and read them. Again, over 500 pages, so it's not light reading. I went through the whole thing to try and make sure that we were prepared for this. If we could go to the next slide, please. What we're going to talk about here is kind of that proposed new Rule 10 under the Securities Exchange Act. So next slide, please. So what's happening is that, you know, the SEC opened up for comment on the 15th of this year, of March. And, you know, what they're doing is they're really starting to look at, you know, who is going to be impacted by these requirements on the market entities, which we'll get into. And, you know, so some of the requirements apply to a subset of the market entities referred to as covered entities, which will provide you a definition around that. So the proposal, which takes up more than 500 pages, defines covered entities kind of with 4 core requirements, right? They got to have cybersecurity policies. They have to have notifications and reporting, public disclosure, and record keeping. And so if we go to the next slide, this is kind of to give you a view in terms of who these covered entities are. I'm not going to read this list to you. You can kind of read through that. But what's going to happen is it's going to require these groups of covered entities to essentially maintain records in such a manner. So it's also going to impact, you know, the registered broker or dealers that maintain custody of cash and securities for customers and other broker dealers. It's going to be introducing customer accounts from one broker dealer to another. They're going to have to maintain also, and it's also going to have regulatory, if you have a regulatory capital equal to 50 million or greater, or you have total equal assets of greater than $1 billion. So this is the group that is really going to be impacted, right? So, you know, also market makers are now covered under the Exchange Act and its rules, or the rules for the SRO, of which the broker or the dealer is a member. So essentially, it's going to be looking at operating as an alternative trading system, you know, an ATS, or it's going to operate as an NMS stock for an ATS. So what's going to happen is this is the group that is going to have to actually be impacted by what's going on, and you can kind of see who they are and see, you know, if this applies to you. But let's jump into it now on the next slide. So these are the new requirements that we're thinking about that are being proposed for the market entities related to cybersecurity, right? So all market entities are going to be required to establish and maintain and enforce policies and procedures reasonably designed to address their cybersecurity risks. They would also be required to review and assess them annually, including whether they reflect changes in the cybersecurity risk. Covered entities would be required to prepare a report and review with other market entities preparing a record of it, right? So these covered entities, you know, they're going to have to do periodic risk assessments. They're going to have to look at controls. They're going to have to be monitoring information systems and you know, really oversee the service providers who are working that involves any of their systems. So that's your third and your fourth parties. They're going to have to measure, you know, to detect, mitigate, and remediate threats and vulnerabilities. We'll get more into that in a bit. And they're going to be measuring to detect and respond to recover from cybersecurity incidents involving written documents and of the incident response and recovery, and how it's actually going to have to be filed. So if you take a look at the next slide, please, this is really whole notification capability that's going on. And so the notification is talking about it's going to have to be written and how it's going to be proposed. But what's going to be happening is that the requirement would be triggered by a reasonable basis to conclude that there has been or that a cyber incident is recurring, right? So these covered entities are also going to be required to be providing the SEC with some detailed reports. That report structure is actually going to be called what's called a Form SCIR. And this is going to require that the incident be reported and filed on a confidential basis with the SEC within 20, as promptly as possible, but no later than 48 hours after they have they believe that an incident has or is recurring, right? And so these filings would then also have to be updated with such new information that is discovered upon the resolution of the incident. So it's not just a once and done, it's going to be kind of a living process. And then they're also going to have to be showing how they're conducting the internal investigation and providing the internal investigation incident report over, right? So this is a significant change because these folks don't do this today, right? So a significant cyber event, is really going to be defined as an incident where it's going to significantly disrupt or degrade the ability of the entity to maintain critical operations, or it's going to lead to an unauthorized access or use of information where the access results in or is likely to result in substantial harm to the entity or the customer or the counterparty or a member or the registrant in the market entity. So it's a very broad requirement that they're talking about as to how they're going to have to do it. So you say, hey, we have to give them notice. This is the form in which we have to give them the notice. This is the time frame in which we have to actually provide them the notice. And then from there, how do we actually continue to keep updating that? So if we go to the next slide, please. This is the public disclosures. And this is important because today it's a little tricky as to how people are doing things. Now it's going to be somewhat prescriptive. So the public disclosure is the covered entities are going to be required to make two types of public disclosures. And essentially what they're going to be doing is they're going to have to be able to post it on their website in an easily accessible portion of their website, right? So this, as an example, could not be put behind a paywall. It has to be put where the public, anybody, client or non-client, could actually reach it. So the first requirement would be to have a plain English summary of the cyber incident. This is what happened, and they need to be able to articulate how it could materially affect the entity's business and operations and how the entity has assessed, prioritized, and is addressing those risks, right? The second requirement that they have is really kind of the summary of each cybersecurity incident and how it's occurred. So this summary must include the person or persons that are affected, the incident, which when was it discovered and is it still ongoing? They also has to disclose who the people or groups are that assessed or are used the data. In other words, what is it that they're taking and how could it actually impact and which groups are impacted, right? And the effect of the incident, what is that doing on the entity's operations? How is it actually impacting it? And whether the incident has been remediated or is currently being remediated. So there's a lot of transparency that's going on here, right? And the SEC has acknowledged that disclosing too much information could increase risk by assisting future attackers to kind of understand how they could take and learn from that to actually apply it at another attack. And so they're saying they want this information to be disclosed, but at a high level, so that it's not so detailed that bad actors have the ability to kind of learn from that, right? And they're also introducing these covered entities that are introducing broker-dealers or carrying broker-dealers are asking them to really kind of provide a form to the customers at the account opening, where the form will be updated on an annual basis related to cybersecurity. So again, there's a lot of changes that are going to have to kind of filter through an organization's operational capabilities, and it will be changing some of the practices that are going on. And of course, if we go to the next slide, record keeping, right? So it's really important that all the market entities need to preserve and certain records for specific requirements depending on the market entity. Now, that's because that's going to allow not just the SEC regulators, but other regulatory entities to come in and take a look and dissect that information and understand what's really happening. So record keeping is critical, and you need to be able to show that you have a formal process that is established, that is maintained, that has a policy around it, and that you actually are able to tangibly demonstrate the protection of where that's happening. So there's a lot of work that needs to go through. Now, the amendment has a lot of detail. So I've broken it down into a number of different steps. So if we could go through the next slide, please. The next slide. So essentially, when you start thinking about this, the regulation SEI amendments, these are really the systems compliance and integrity. That's what SEI stands for. The SEI currently imposes a number of requirements concerning system operations and compliance, including having comprehensive policies and procedures reasonably designed to ensure that certain systems maintain operational capability and promote the maintenance of fair and orderly markets, having policies and procedures reasonably designed to ensure certain systems operate in a manner that is compliant with the Exchange Act and the entity's own rules and governing documents, taking corrective action as needed in response to the system issues, and providing notice to the commissioner, i.e. the SEC commissioner, and conducting the annual compliance reviews. These conducting annual compliance reviews are going to become very, very critical, and they're going to be required to be providing these. So, the proposed amendment, again, would expand the scope of the SEI entities covered by the rules. So currently the SEI entities are self-regulatory organizations containing large ATSs and plan processors, certain clearing agencies, and so it's really broadening the aperture in terms of who is actually going to have to be looked at. And under the proposed amendments, the reach of the rules can be extended, again, to the broker dealers, to the registered security swap data repositories, and the clearing agencies, right? So, when you're looking at these changes, are bringing the largest broker dealers along with the swap data repositories, under the umbrella of the regulation SCI. So the proposed amendments are quite numerous, and these amendments are going to be adding a significant amount of detail. So if we could get to the next slide. So, the SEC regulation for these amendments are going to be, these are some of the things that we got to be thinking about. They're going to have maintenance of written inventory of systems, classifications of those systems. You should already have that today. So this one shouldn't be that difficult to implement. Really looking at the program to manage and oversee the third-party providers and to provide the functionality support, for service directly or indirectly to the SEI systems. Well, we should already have third-party risk programs. We should already have cyber programs. We should already have, forums that are in place. But this is now making sure from another lens, because if you're in financial services, the OC, whether you're regulated by the OCC, the FRB, or the FDIC, they already have prescribed components for this. But this is now starting to kind of dovetail into where you're going. So as you look at this, there's quite an expansion of the business continuity disaster recovery plans to address unavailability of any third-party provider that provides functionality, support, and service for the SEI entity, without which there would be a material impact. So in other words, who is your critical supplier? And again, how are you managing that critical supplier? And what is it that you did? And this is going to tie into what is the risk appetite that you have as an organization? How are you then identifying materially whether the entity in your disaster recovery plan is actually a critical supplier or anything above your, higher critical above your risk appetite? And you need to be able to say, this is what happens if the system goes down, right? So that you have to really identify what a critical system is, right? And the expansion is requiring policies and procedures to include a program to prevent unauthorized access. So in other words, what are you doing from a preventative perspective, and how can you tangibly demonstrate that you actually have gone through and really rigor tested what you're doing? And then it's going to require an increased frequency in the penetration testing. So today the requirement is every 3 years. It is moving to annually. That is going to increase costs for people, because that's a big deal, especially if you have large complex systems that are interconnected. You're going to have to do these pen tests. We all know that these pen tests are not cheap and they take some time. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to be actually optimizing that. The next slide, please, is a continuation of where we're at. And this is really an expansion of the definition of the systems intrusion, right? So this is to include any event that disrupts or significantly degrades the normal operation for an SCI system, such as a DoD denial of service attack or attempted, or attacks and attempted and unsuccessful or significant unauthorized systems entries. You have to log these and you have to report these, okay? And again, this is something that you're probably already doing to a certain level, but now the SEC is saying they're proposing that you're going to have to provide that information to them. And as I said before, as soon as possible, no later than 48 hours after it's been discovered. Now, it's requiring you to notify the commission of the system's intrusion without delay. And again, there will be penalties associated with not complying with that, right? And there's also a requirement that, that the objective personnel assess the risks of the covered systems, internal control designs, operating effectiveness, and third-party provider management risks and controls. So now they're not just looking at the cyber inside the CIO's organization, they're starting to take a look at how is the cyber impact actually happening within the third-party risk management program, as well as the regular operation. So, all of these are essentially, really big changes that are happening, and the revisions to the requirements, SCI requirements and reviews. They're asking you to essentially detail out what's actually happening, and the ANSI 2, which is the American Code for Information Exchange, needs to be described. And if we go to the next slide, please. So what's happening is, clarifying the following current industry standards operates as a safe harbor by adding the word safe harbor to the rule. Okay, that is going to have a legal implication when you say safe harbor as to what actually happens. So there's a whole, it's not just a minor change, that's an actually significant legal change that, your organization is going to have to be looking through, right? And then, you're going to have to be providing, again, the policies and procedures, and they actually need to include dissemination information about an event for the, for your customers. In other words, so you got to say, this is what's going to happen should this happen. And then updated record keeping provisions consistent with the amendments and record keeping requirements for all entities that cease to qualify as an SEC entity. Now, again, there's 14 very high level regulations, and not everybody is in agreement with it. So as an example, one of the commissioners, Hester Pierce, has issued a statement where she's saying that she's objecting to the proposed amendments as being overly prescriptive. And she's arguing that the updates to the Reg SCI would create micromanagement for the covered entities and operations that may already have in place, market, reputation, regulatory incentives to adequately address their systems in order to make sure that they're actually performing as they should, and providing the protection that's necessary and communicating effectively. So Commissioner Pierce noted that the Reg SCI amendments overlap significantly, but not entirely, with the Commissioner's proposed Regulation SP and the Cybersecurity Management Rule, without rationalizing whether there are deltas in there or what exists between them. So again, there's not complete consistency, and as I said, and I recommend that you actually go and take a look at the proposed amendments. So let's move on and let's talk about the Regulation SP that she says is kind of overlapping, and you will see that there is some overlap there. Next slide, please. One more, please. There you go. So the Regulation SP amendments, were adopted in 2000 and known as the safeguard rules, right? So, as you can kind of read up there, it's really talking about, the policies and procedures and the safeguards, but the regulation also requires the proper disposal of information, both by covered institutions as well as by transfer agents registered with the SEC. So that's something that we've got to be thinking about. And the SEC's proposal would expand the rule by adding the requirement for an incident response program and also a requirement to notify the affected individuals of a data breach. So, when we think about that, there's 5 things that the proposal is specifically telling us that we need to think about, i.e. The incident response program, the customer notification, the scope of information, the transfer agents, and the record keeping. Now, let's go to the next slide, please. One more, please. So the cybersecurity management for registered investment and advisor funds, well, essentially, there's a lot of work that they need to think about in terms of what's going on and how they're actually responding to it, right? So again, I pointed out that they reopened the comment period, and I've stated that because there's actually multiple proposals that we're covering that are all related to cybersecurity that all impact third-party risk management, and each one of them has a slightly different. The comment period all open on the 15th of March, but they have slightly different end dates for when the responses need to go. Most of them are within the next 10 business days. So it's really important that you guys actually take a look at that, right? And so with that, why don't we get to the next slide, please? Okay, so when we start to think about where we're at from a, looking at the third-party consideration of these proposed amendments, the rules are definitely going to be impacting us in a number of different ways, right? So the way we're looking at that is that it's really important for us to be thinking about how our third-party vendors and suppliers are poised with their cybersecurity postures. So that means that you need to have really good audit provisions within your master agreements with your suppliers in order to make sure that you're able to go in there and actually do the types of testing that you need to do on what they're actually doing. So in a nutshell, what they're basically telling you is, do you have the ability to actually audit them? And do you have the ability to actually disclose the information about, how they're managing risks and how you're managing risks, right? And if a company experiences material services or incidents, what is it that they're able to do? So it's really important that these disclosures and proposals are being reviewed by your legal organization, by your IT organization, by your third-party risk management, and I would even say by your procurement organization, because they're going to be on the front line, and obviously the front and middle office from an operations perspective. It's really important for us to kind of take a look at that. Next slide, please. So when you start thinking about the comprehensive assessments that they're going to need to start doing, there's a tremendous amount of work that has already gone into actually creating your governance programs today, right? So it's a matter of going in there and making sure that the proposals that you have are and your comprehensive risk assessments are really are really working, right? So the proposed rules emphasize the needs that for companies to conduct thorough risk assessments of their third-party providers. This includes evaluating their cybersecurity practices, their governance, their incident response capabilities, and this is something that we think that we've been doing, but not all of the entities that are now covered have, right? The big banks have been doing this for many years, but when you take a look at some of the other ones, some of the other covered entities that are covered, they have not. When you start thinking about the contractual management or contractual obligations, right? You need to make sure that you're companies are establishing clear contractual obligations for their third-party service providers. They outline the cybersecurity standards. They must adhere to this reporting requirements for these cyber incidents, and so you have to have a program, not just a policy. You have to be able to tangibly demonstrate that it's actually working. And so that whole ongoing monitoring and remediation, right? So the importance of the ongoing monitoring and remediation efforts to address these cybersecurity risks associated with the third parties cannot be understated, right? This includes regularly assessing and updating your third-party risk management practices, ensuring that the appropriate controls are in place to mitigate any potential risks. So this is an area that will be reviewed by the regulators, and they will not hesitate to issue regulatory findings to you, because multiple regulators are going to be looking at this. So you could get what's called an MRA, an MIRA, or even consent orders, et cetera. And so it's important that you actually are monitoring and have a program that's robust enough to actually be able to provide the information in a format that can be audited by the regulators and yourselves. So if we go to the next slide. So essentially, we have been doing this for many years, but again, some of these covered entities have not had to do this, establish a TPRM governance framework, right? So they got to develop a formal cybersecurity governance structure within the third-party risk management program, outlining the roles and the responsibilities and reporting lines, right? So this framework should be integrated into the company's overall risk management and cybersecurity governance processes, right? And this, you also need to ensure that the board of directors and senior management are actively involved in overseeing these third-party risks. So it's not just about it's not a check the box exercise. It's about how do you actually put a real governance framework in place that's going to give you what you're looking for, right? And it needs to be implemented on a risk-based approach. So, as they're prioritized third-party risk assessments and monitoring efforts, the potential impact of each relationship to the company's cybersecurity profile. So, as we look at the high-risk relationships and we implement additional controls and mitigation measures needed, you got to remember that you're looking at this through the lens of a risk of the activity, the risk of the supplier, and the risk of the incident. Okay, and so you're looking at that, and again, we talked very briefly about every organization has a formal risk appetite. Okay, and they need to be able to tangibly demonstrate that whatever they're actually doing from an incident-based perspective is within the guidelines associated with what that risk appetite is, right? And obviously it's important to leverage technology, right? So, like looking at solutions that are going to give you the ability to automate this process and to enhance your risk assessments and your contract management, right? So these technologies can help companies identify risks more efficiently and ensure consistent application of their third-party risk management policies and procedures, and they can help you govern the process more effectively. So leveraging technologies can't be understated. Next slide, please. So again, the regular reporting and communication. So you have to establish a regular reporting and communication process and cadence, right? You need to keep the board of directors and senior management informed about the third-party risks and the effectiveness of the third-party risk management program as it relates to cyber, right? These processes should include, periodic reviews, key performance indicators, risk assessments, incident reports, the minutes that are coming forward from your various governance committees. So, having that regular communication is really important. And it goes hand in hand with collaboration and information sharing, right? So you got to foster a culture of collaboration and information sharing, both internally and with your third-party service providers, right? You need to encourage open communication and the sharing of best practices, lessons learned, and threat intelligence to improve the overall cybersecurity resilience. This is critical. You can't just be internally focused. This has to really be, I think about it like a Rubik's Cube. You can't be just thinking about one side of that Rubik's Cube. If you're going to solve it, you've got to be thinking about all the moving pieces as you're doing that. And I think that this is really important. And that kind of leads into the training and awareness, right? So you got to implement an ongoing training and awareness programs for your employees and the third-party service providers to ensure that they understand their roles and responsibilities in managing cybersecurity risks. This includes providing the guidance, on hardware, identifying potential incidents, as well as offering resources and tools to support their activities. So by implementing these critical third-party risk management capabilities, best practices, and strategies, we as companies can effectively address the new SEC cybersecurity requirements and mitigate the risks associated with our third-party relationships, and hopefully not have a negative impact on our if we're public, on our shareholders, right? So this is really important for us to think about that. So we got to be thinking about the implications for public companies and their third-party management programs. So let's go to the next slide, please. So the proposed updates for the SEC Cybersecurity Rules have significant implications on public companies and their TPRM programs. So to comply to these new requirements, companies should be thinking about, what I have here. I don't want to just read it, strengthening their TPRM programs, and, really ensure that, they're doing essentially all the stuff that we've been asked to do since OCC 213-29 came out, but now it's actually kind of rounding. And now we know that it's not just what the SEC is proposing. You have the combined guidelines that have not been published yet, but have been proposed between the OCC, the FRB, and the FDIC. So all of this is starting to come together, right? So there's a little bit of overlap, but there's a consistency. So it's the solving of the rubric that's important. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. And so, when you think about it, these proposed updates from the SEC Cybersecurity Rules, they're really aimed to improve transparency and consistency in the public companies' disclosure of their cybersecurity risks, their management practices, and their third-party relationships, right? So these proposed updates will require public companies to provide more detailed information about their cybersecurity and management strategies. So it can't be in somebody's head. It's got to be something that's actually put down to paper or electronic, and it's got to be something that is identifying what is the role of the board of directors in overseeing cybersecurity risk. What are the qualifications of the directors responsible for that cybersecurity oversight? How is that program actually being distilled? Who are the practitioners that are in there, and are they qualified? What are the certifications that they have associated with what they're trying to do? So it's no longer just something that is lip service. This is something that is a tangible program that is really starting to put pen to paper, so to speak, in terms of what the actual requirements are going to be, and then how they're actually going to come in and take a look at that. Now, they're proposing these as guidelines, okay? But they are also using the word requirements. So, a guideline can be very broad, a requirement can be very specific. So we've got to really think about this. And this is because when you take a look at the number of high-profile cybersecurity breaches that have happened, not just with these entities, but with their supply chains, it's pretty dramatic. I mean, when you think back, over the last 5 years, the number of cyber incidents that have happened where the penetration into the entity actually came through a third party, and it's come across. It's not just from a securities perspective. Think about this as to what happened at Target, right? With the way their systems were accessed by an HVAC dealer, right? So you got to think about a lot of these types of activities that are happening and how they're actually impacting you. So this isn't for them. This is for us. This is for we. And so it's really important that we think about how it is that we're structuring these programs, and that we're putting these programs in such a manner that they have a consistent, tangible, repeatable, and measurable outcome to what we're doing. Because otherwise, what we're going to do is we're going to spend a lot of money, we're going to waste a lot of time, and we're going to have huge reputational issues to the organizations that are trying to do this. And so it's really important that you not just be thinking about what these proposed updates are going to be, but you're actually looking at them and saying, okay, what is the plan that we have to make sure that they happen? And I totally recommend that you guys go and you take a look at the actual verbiage. Again, it's over 500 pages. I went through it over the last couple of weeks, trying to make sure that I had enough information relevant to what I was extracting, because again, we could probably talk for 3 or 4 hours on this stuff, and I'm trying to kind of keep it at a high enough level. But it's important that we're thinking about, what are the considerations of these proposed amendments, and how are they going to impact not just our organization, but our organization's ecosystem. So there's plenty of information that needs to be considered about that. Next slide, please. So we come to the fact where we have some questions. I think we're going to have probably a poll that's probably or two that's going to come out, and then we're going to open it up to questions and answers.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and launch that poll real quick and then pitch it over to Scott. I'm going to launch it and then I'll stop sharing. So, let us know if you're looking to augment or establish a third-party risk program in the coming months. And, please be honest, because we do follow up with you. We want to make sure that we do our due diligence. So hopefully you guys see that coming up on your screen. Let's see. It's not looking like it is on my end.
Yeah, I don't see the poll.
Let's see if I can relaunch it. Let's see, relaunch. There you go. Too easy. All right. So hopefully that's working. There you go. And then if you want to, move out of the way, just answer it, please. And then I will pitch it over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Melissa, very much. Hi, everybody. Just wanted to take a couple of minutes here at the end of Joseph's presentation and talk about what Prevalent can do to help you simplify the process of assessing and monitoring your third parties. Whether or not you're trying to address potential SEC disclosure rules, or pretty much any other requirement, whether it be compliance driven, cybersecurity driven, data privacy driven, or even driven by a physical supply chain challenge. Ultimately, when we talk to our customers, they tell us they want to achieve any one of these three things. First is getting data they need to make better decisions. And that can mean data from different internal systems that don't talk to one another, or good data from suppliers and vendors and third parties on their specific policies and processes and practices around cyber resilience and data protection and more. Second, they want to increase team efficiency and break down silos. A lot of times what we see is that, maybe the IT security team is responsible primarily for owning the third-party risk management program, but we find that procurement owns vendor, third-party supplier, partner relationships, and nary the two shall meet. So, breaking down those silos and getting good information flow between the teams, rallying around a central set of processes, this tends to be, something that customers tell us they want to achieve. And then third, be ready for what's next. Evolving and scaling your third-party risk management program to make sure that you're able to achieve not just your objectives for assessing vendors and meeting compliance requirements today, but also have a good foundation to kind of build and expand on for the future, whether that be adding more vendors and suppliers to the equation or addressing new types of compliance requirements. Our approach is to solve this problem at every stage of the third-party vendor and supplier relationship. From our perspective, the third-party risk management challenge really isn't just a challenge that happens when you're onboarding a new vendor or conducting an annual due diligence exercise. It is pervasive across the life of that supplier third-party vendor relationship. Everything from making sure that you've got the right intelligence to make a good risk-based supplier selection decision, to doing some contractual management and ensuring the right contract clauses, right to audit, and more is built into the contract, to performing some level of inherent risk assessment. So you got an initial picture of the risks that a potential vendor kind of introduces to the organization, to conducting that full and comprehensive due diligence exercise, not just on IT security issues and data privacy issues, but also on ESG or bribery and corruption, or other types of reputational related risks that can also add context to whether or not that vendor is delivering up to their obligations. Continuously monitoring and then validating the results of those assessments with cybersecurity, operational, financial, reputational monitoring, things like that. Measuring service levels and performance against contractual expectations. Not every risk is going to be, an event-driven risk that you're working with third parties. Sometimes it's performance-related, where they're not living up to their service levels or falling short of key risk indicators, key performance indicators. Being able to track that is essential to maintaining a healthy relationship. And then finally, as every relationship will eventually do, when it's time to offboard or terminate a vendor relationship, having good processes in place to end that relationship and make sure that your company is not exposed to risk, beyond the end of the contract lifecycle. Again, our three objectives here for looking at third-party risk from the point you source a vendor to the point you offboard them after that relationship ends is to accomplish three things: to simplify and speed up the onboarding process at the beginning with a single source of the truth for the entire organization to rally around for that particular vendor, and a single process to move that vendor throughout the relationship. Second, to streamline the process and close gaps in risk coverage. And then third, to bring all your teams together around the third-party lifecycle. Right, that's our view of it: to knock down the silos, get you good intelligence, and then to build and follow a process that enables you to assess that vendor throughout the life cycle. We address more than just cybersecurity risks, although those tend to be the primary ones, of course, we're concerned about. We also deliver insight and built-in assessments that help you gather information with regard to business and operational risks, financial risks, ESG, reputational compliance risks. speaking of ESG, we're talking about the SEC Cybersecurity Disclosure Rules today. There's an awful lot of chatter out there from the SEC on ESG, and I anticipate we'll probably have another webinar about that, pretty soon as well. We do deliver an automated solution that helps you not just, leverage the people that we have and the experts that we have to onboard and manage vendors and suppliers on your behalf, but consume and collate a ton of data and then house it in a platform that allows you to build in workflow and reporting and more to reduce risk. Again, at the end of the day, our objective is to help your organization be smarter in how it handles third-party risk, consolidate information, get you down to a unified single source of the truth, and give you prescriptive guidance to work with that vendor throughout its relationship. And specific to today's topic, we've actually written a checklist document that examines these cybersecurity disclosure rules. And then we've mapped out some of the high-level requirements that Joseph referred to in the webinar today, identified some critical third-party risk capabilities to address those requirements. And then we've included a little bit of prevalent content in there as well to explain kind of how we address those requirements. There's a link in here if you want to write it down. We'll leave it up on the screen here as the Q&A progresses, but we will include a link to this checklist in the follow-up tomorrow with the recording of this webinar. So anyway, so net of it is, our approach is to help you address third-party risk across the life cycle. We've got built-in content to help you address SEC-specific cybersecurity disclosure rules, and that's continuing to evolve as the rule comes to finality soon. And that's what I wanted to share. Back to you, Melissa.
Awesome. Thank you, Scott. Make sure you're dropping any of those questions you have in the Q&A. I know we have a few, so let's go ahead and see how many we can get through in the last, 14 minutes or so. I'll just start at the top here. Joseph, what framework is used by SEC to determine cybersecurity guidelines?
Well, again, they are basically giving you guidelines, okay? But in practice, what they're really expecting you to look at is, what is the frameworks like the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or the framework for improving critical infrastructure, which is the ISO 27001 standards, or the CIS controls framework, right? So they're not giving you a specific framework, but these are the frameworks that that they're looking at. They're giving you proposed guidelines. And again, so here are the guidelines and here are the requirements, but the actual framework is actually driven by things like, again, like I said, like NIST or some of these other ones. So it's one of those areas where they're trying not to be so prescriptive that it becomes very difficult, or if they left something out, it creates a big issue for them. Hopefully I answered your question.
I guess we'll find out if they don't have a follow-up, but second question for you. It appears as if SEC is playing catch-up. Financial institutions that are regulated under GLBA already have all these requirements from the FFIEC. So what's the impetus here?
Well, I think the emphasis is the fact that they've expanded the scope of who's covered. So I think the FFIEC does have a lot of these that are covered, but when you take a look at how they've expanded who is actually being impacted by this, and I think it kind of ties into our next question, which was around the who the covered entities were. If you go back to slide 10, if you could pull that back up, that would essentially show you who these folks are that are being impacted by it, right? So I don't disagree that they are playing a bit of catch up, but again, it's also broadening the aperture to some of these others that were not covered, right? So when you think about this group, including many types of broker dealers, clearing agencies, right, major securities-based swap participants, or municipal securities rulemaking board, or the National Securities Association, the National Securities Exchanges, and the security-based swap data repositories, that's all who's now being impacted. And then you're starting to see kind of the list that I put in here. And again, I put that kind of word graph out there so you could kind of see that it's pretty complicated as to who they're at. So it's not just the traditional groups. They've now opened the aperture and are really starting to expand into areas where before they were self-regulated, and now they're actually saying, look, you need to be able to, as a covered entity, you need to be able to be to be able to adhere and show us what you're actually doing. So I think, yes, I don't disagree that it was a bit of catch up, but on the other hand, it's also expanding as to people who have not had to do any of these things in the past.
Okay, I see you answered that second question as well. So I guess next one, if a bank is already complying with OCC guidance, does it need to also comply with SEC? Meaning with some data privacy rules, if the company already complies with another regime, such as GLBA, they are exempt.
I think what happens is if a bank is under the jurisdiction of both, as an example, the OCC and the SEC, they generally need to comply with the rules and regulations of both agencies. So it's not, you can't rely on the fact that you actually are doing something with one regulator, right? So again, these may have overlapping rules, and I think that's why one of the comments that I made was why the commissioner was thinking that there's a lot of overlap. But as an example, think of the Graham-Leach Bailey Act, the GBLA. It has requirements related to customer data privacy that appear on a wide range of financial institutions, right? In compliance with GBLA, you might fulfill certain regulatory requirements, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the institution is compliant with the OCC or what the SEC rules are, just because they're compliant with what GBLA is. So it can't be one and done. It's that whole rubrics that I was talking to you about. So the specifics can be quite complex, and depending on the variety of factors that of the activities that are going on, you're going to have to kind of take a look at what the specific regulations are, and there's nuance in there. And when you are inspected, you're going to see that there's going to be interpretation of the guidelines and the requirements. And so therefore, you've got to make sure that you're adhering to the spirit of both regulators. So it's not a once and done.
Okay. Next question. Do any of the proposed rules specifically address data privacy concerns?
The answer to that is yes. Again, it's 500 pages long. I can't point you directly to where it's at, but the answer to that is yes.
Some light reading for you, right?
Yeah.
I do have a question. Maybe Scott, this can also be you, I'm not sure. In general, how long should it take to onboard a new vendor?
That's going to vary now. Oh, for Scott.
Yeah, sorry. I was going to say, into the Prevalent platform, it does kind of depend. I mean, it's simple enough to use like an intake form that we already have built into the platform. We've got an API connection to some different systems. Like if you've got a vendor system of record, like an accounts payable system, a supplier management tool, whatever, we can build a connection into that or use an API that we already have to consume that data and create your comprehensive vendor profile in Prevalent that you can then build your assessment strategy from. It really kind of depends. It's pretty quick to get a vendor onboarded, but if you're going to do a bunch of them, you're going to want to set aside a couple hours.
Joseph, any other comment on that one?
Repeat the question one more time, please.
Yeah, in general, how long should it take to onboard a new vendor?
As long as it takes. But no, that being said, when you think about it, guys, okay, there's a whole due diligence. You think about it, you got planning, you got your due diligence, you got your contracting, ongoing monitoring, your termination in that third-party risk management life cycle, right? So depending on what is actually happening within that environment, you're going to be looking at the risk associated with not just the activity, the risk with the supplier, and that's going to dictate the amount of due diligence that you're actually going to have to do on that supplier. So it's going to vary. If it's a low risk supplier, it's going to be pretty quick to onboard them. Okay, if it's a critical supplier that could potentially bring down your business or a portion of your business, that's going to be much more diligent, right? If they're going to be connecting to your network, if they're going to actually have access to client information. So again, I'm not trying to be flippant here. I'm just telling you it's going to vary based on the risk associated with the activity and the supplier. And so, there's not, well, I would like to say that, as we've been automating things through the years and trying to refine what we're doing in terms of our risk assessments and questionnaires, et cetera, we're trying to kind of streamline that where we can. But at the end of the day, there are certain things that you can't deviate from, and they take time when two organizations are interacting with each other, trying to actually get to closure from an onboarding perspective.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one or two questions. In the presentation, it was stated to look towards automating or streamlining the third-party supplier assessment process. Do you have any suggestions on how this can be done specifically with avoiding a lengthy questionnaire? As more requirements are put in place, assessments will only get longer. How can we keep it manageable for our third parties?
Well, again, I think it's by standardizing your process, right? If you're using a standardized questionnaire that is, kind of like from an industry perspective, like the ISO 27001 or the NIST frameworks, right? These are consistent, and these are approaches. In financial services, one of the things that we've seen to help with that process, and it's not just from a tool perspective, it's actually leveraging utilities, okay? There was a utility out there called TrueSight, right? And so that was enabling the pre-validation of assessments for a large part of this process for entities that are doing multiple relationships with different banks, right? So I think, at the end of the day, you have to have a standard process. You got to think about this from a risk-based approach. You've got to leverage shared assessments wherever you can, and you need to really think, in terms of the automation in the software, right? Software tools, you got to think about the platforms that can automate the assessment process as much as possible by, sending out questionnaires, tracking responses, flagging potential issues. But these tools are really not a substitute for a third party and an accountable executive for actually using what's in their head to help actually drive that. You can't just put it in and expect something to come out without actually reviewing it and understanding it, right? So I think that while they're trying to, well, it's important to automate as much as you can. At the end of the day, you still have to have a methodology, and that methodology needs to have the oversight of individuals that are skilled and capable of making conscientious decisions around how you're actually onboarding that supplier and how you're doing it. But I do agree that getting the questionnaires standardized as much as possible at an industry level is an important factor and will reduce the time.
And I think we have time for one more. It's a little overarching, nice to seal the deal, put the nail in the coffin, if you will. When do you believe these proposals will become final, and will institutions have a little bit of a runway to come into full compliance?
A, they will have a little bit of runway to come into compliance. And B, I can't tell you. Let me give you an example, okay? It's already been almost 2 years since the combined guidelines were proposed guidelines for third-party risk management between the OCC, the FRB, and the FDIC came out. They put it out for a comment period. They reopened the comment period. They received over 1,900 comments. Okay, and so they're having to kind of, in that instance, they were going through trying to understand, which comments were duplicative, which ones actually they needed to do. And then there's also negotiation between those regulators. That's been a couple of years. They thought it was going to come out in less than a year. Okay, when you take a look at these proposed guidelines, they reopened the comment period on March the 15th. Part of them, could you bring up the deck one more time and go to the very last slide? Because I want folks to be able to kind of see this. And I know it's going to be hard for them to read, but the appendix information.
All right. Can you guys see that?
Yeah. So maybe a little hard to see, but guys, all of these were uploaded and were put into the Federal Register, and the reopen period was on March the 15th, as you see there. But if you look to the right, okay, each one of these is slightly different. You'll start to see when the period is for closing them. June 15th for comments, right? May 22nd for comments, June 5th for comments. So when you're looking at that, okay, all of these need to be coalesced. They need to get through the comment period. They need to then start to work through them. So I think it's going to be longer. Hopefully we get through this by Q4 of this year, but there's no guarantee that that's not going to happen like what happened with the combined guidelines for TPRM, which, we're going on 2 years now. So, I'm not trying to say gloom and doom. I'm trying to say, let's look at it through the lens of what's happened in other areas. And when you take a look at, a lot of these have overlap, and they're going to have to go in and and really trying to kind of refine what it is that they're trying to do. But I mean, the information is out there if you want to go through it. Again, I went through all of these. It was over 500 pages. I almost went blind, but it's well worth taking a look at to kind of be thinking about what's next, because this is going to be very, very important, and it will impact how you do business. If you're a public company, it's going to impact your stock if you get it wrong.
Perfect. Well, thank you again so much, Joseph and Scott, of course. Thanks everyone for all your questions. And I did drop my email in the chat, if you have any future questions that cross your mind at a later time. And lastly, I hope to see a handful of you in your inboxes and at a future webinar. Take care, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.